United Nations General Assembly continues in New York as world leaders address rising poverty and climate change. Chavista lawmakers in Venezuela returned to the opposition-controlled National Assembly as part of the agreement on dialogue. And the U.S. House of Representatives launches an impeachment inquiry into President Donald Trump. Hello and welcome to Telesur English. I am Estefania Bravo and this is From the South. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has emphasized economic inequality and climate change while speaking at the start of the 74th session of the United Nations General Assembly in New York. Addressing world leaders, he also criticized recent attacks on oil facilities in Saudi Arabia. The UN Secretary General further announced his support for a meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. World leaders have gathered at the UN amid tight security to discuss global issues under this year's theme, galvanizing multilateral efforts for poverty eradication, quality education, climate action, and inclusion. During his intervention, the Bolivian president told the General Assembly that only joint international action could confront the multiple threats that put in danger the future of humanity.
The consequences of climate change will condemn, according to our own UN figures, millions of people to poverty and hunger. They will not have drinking water, they will lose their homes, and will be forced into mass displacement, leading to huge waves of migration and new armed conflicts. The underlying problem resides in the model of production and consumerism, in the private ownership of natural resources and the unequal distribution of wealth. We need to say very clearly that the root of the problem is in the capitalist system.
The Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza is also present at the UNGA meeting. Earlier in the day, the minister met with the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, and also called on the Security Council to neutralize the activation of the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance. When speaking to the press after these meetings, Arreaza responded to claims made by the mainstream media and the international right wing that President Nicolás Maduro is a puppet of Cuba.
You said about the puppet, no? Yeah. That Maduro is a Cuban puppet.
President Trump called Nicolás Maduro a Cuban puppet.
Yeah.
Did you have a reaction in English?
I think, in first place, that Trump is the puppet of imperialism, of capitalism. He responds to money accumulation, to capital accumulation. But the real puppets in our region are those presidents that got together yesterday, or that they failed in the OAS. They failed then, they created this Lima group, they failed. Now they are conveying the TR, the Rio Treaty, and they're failing again. And they are the puppets of Donald Trump. They do what he wants. So those are the puppets. We respect Cuba. Cuba respects Venezuela. We have a friendship, a brothership that we have, and we will continue working together with Cuba. But the puppets are others in this region.
Uruguay says it will withdraw from the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance, or TR, if its members approve military intervention against Venezuela. The Uruguayan foreign minister pointed out that the treaty cannot be applied against Venezuela since the country is not a member of the treaty. He also said that countries that are pushing for military intervention ignore the intrinsic value of the treaty, since it was designed for the defense of member countries against external aggression. TR member nations later decided to impose more sanctions on Venezuela, but for the moment ruled out using military force.
The Brazilian government understands clearly that the impact of the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance, or the Rio Treaty, regarding the situation in Venezuela is a very sensitive issue. But we also know that special circumstances require exceptional response.
Let's go now to the United Nations in New York, where our correspondent Jorge Gestoso is with the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, Gaston Browne.
Thank you very much. We are here at the United Nations. Today, the General Assembly is starting the debates, and we have the honor to have the presence of the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda. We're talking about Gaston Browne. Mr. Prime Minister, thanks very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Mr. Prime Minister, what about your region is absolutely facing the huge problem of climate change. We're talking about the Hurricane Dorian creating really struggles in, for example, Bahamas. Is the UN doing enough for the Caribbean region?
Yeah, well, we continue to call on the international community to help small island states in the Caribbean to build resilience, to mitigate, and certainly to adapt to the effects of climate change. Climate change is the most significant threat facing the planet, and certainly within the Caribbean, we are among the most vulnerable. In fact, part of our vulnerability has to do with very limited financial resources, so we do not quite have the capacity to build climate resilient infrastructure and climate resilient homes. Then you have the situation in which we are getting more frequent storms, more ferocious storms because of the profligacy, the profligate use of fossil fuels by the industrialized countries. They're getting the profits while we are suffering the consequences. So we think that if there ought to be climate justice, that the industrialized countries, the developed world, those who have the resources, they have a responsibility to help small island states in the Caribbean to build resilience and certainly to put the necessary systems in place in order to mitigate and to adapt to the effects of climate change.
Well, we have seen here at the UN on Monday that summit, we're talking about the Action Summit in terms of the climate. Do you believe, or you are bringing some specific agenda, you meaning the small islands of the Caribbean, in order to try to accomplish before the end of this General Assembly?
Well, absolutely. I mean, we have to continue to agitate for industrialized countries to reduce emissions. For us, it's a life and death situation. It's about our own existence, because the science would have shown that even with the present levels of emissions, we will have climate change literally affecting our countries for the next 1,000 years, even without any increase in global temperatures. So it means, therefore, that about 30 generations or more will have to deal with these ferocious and frequent storms. So it is quintessential that we continue to advocate here at the United Nations to get the developed world to reduce emissions, to ensure that we could at least ensure the survival of our respective countries, because already for the next 1,000 years, without any change or let's say any increase in emissions, we know that we have a challenge. And if there increase emissions, then even our survival will be threatened. I mean, some of our countries will literally be away.
Donald Trump, President of the U.S., at least the second, if not the first country contaminating this planet. Probably about 20% of the planet's contamination is done here in the U.S. His words, climate change is a Chinese hoax. What do you think?
Very unfortunate. Climate change is real. The science would have proven that global warming is real, and as a result of global warming, we are having these extreme weather conditions. We are having droughts, we are having floods, we are having frequent and ferocious storms. I think what is required of the United States is for them to take their rightful place and to provide global leadership and responsibility for climate change. For the most significant, the largest economy, the most powerful nation on earth, to shirk its climate responsibility, I think it is unacceptable. And I have to admit, though, that so far, the climate summit yesterday, there have been a number of increased pledges by several nations, and I'm hoping that the United States will follow their lead and to take responsibility and to ensure that we work collectively as human beings, with a common humanity, to deal with what is clearly an existential threat that is facing the entire world. And by the way, whereas small island states literally on the front lines, even non-coastal states and even the hinterlands of these countries will eventually suffer the consequences of climate change if we do not change the destructive habit of literally emitting indiscriminately fossil fuels into the Earth's atmosphere.
We're talking about oil, and we have seen, for example, the attack in the refineries in Saudi Arabia lately, and the whole world, or the prices of the oil went up and down, and it's very, very volatile, the situation. What about the importance of oil in your country and in the Caribbean, and what is the situation regarding oil?
Well, it's still very important, but, we have the ambition of transitioning into green energy by about 2030, certainly no later than 2040. Because, as you indicated, petrol, the prices are unpredictable, and we need stability. We need stability in pricing, and we certainly need to reduce our carbon footprint. In fact, as countries that have been suffering disproportionately the effects of climate change, we too have to lead by example by reducing our carbon footprint. And the whole idea is to have a carbon neutral society by about 2030, certainly no later than 2040. But in terms of the present situation, as a result of an increase in oil prices, you know that we had a deal with PDVSA within the Caribbean, in which they were providing us with concessional petrol. So in the interim, we actually seen literally a reduction, or less elimination for that matter, of the credit that we used to enjoy from PDVSA because they used to supply us. They do not have the capacity now to supply us because of various reasons, including the financial sanctions. Clearly that in itself would have made a number of CARICOM countries more vulnerable, and so certainly more susceptible to the increase in petrol prices globally.
So, in other words, also your country is seeing the effects, the struggle, the strangling of the sanctions in Venezuela, and how that affects the distribution or the supplies in your country are in the Caribbean.
Absolutely. So we perhaps collateral damage as a result of the financial sanctions against Venezuela. And let me just state here that insofar as the effects of financial sanctions that are really literally plunging innocent people into poverty, and at the same time literally causing the deaths of a number of innocent people, we don't think that that is an effective mean to the end of a regime change that certain countries are trying to engineer within Venezuela, because ultimately innocent people are suffering. And we believe that the matter should be resolved through diplomacy and dialogue. We believe in the universal principles of non-interference in the affairs of states, and certainly to respect the sovereignty of states. So we still remain hopeful that some form of diplomatic solution will be found, so that Venezuela could be restored to normalcy, and that the people in Venezuela could literally improve their living standards rather than have the type of economic hardships sustaining themselves.
What about your reaction to the speeches this morning from Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro and President Trump of the U.S. this morning?
Well, the United States should exercise global leadership. Brazil, too, is a significant player within this hemisphere, one of the largest economies within the hemisphere. And we also expect in Brazil to, demonstrate significant leadership. We thought that the most significant issue affecting us within this hemisphere is the issue of climate change. And we do not believe that that matter was ventilated properly. Certainly President Trump did not say much about it, and the President of Brazil would have literally spoken briefly about the Amazon fires. But we think that greater leadership would have been required by those two significant players within this hemisphere.
So finally, Prime Minister, your turn here in the General Assembly is Friday. What is your message? What is the footprint that you would like to leave in this General Assembly?
Well, our most significant issue is the issue of climate change, and following on the heels of what happened in the Bahamas, we have to continue to agitate for change, to agitate for the industrialized countries to reduce their carbon emissions, and for them to live up to their climate responsibility, to provide a type of financial support for poor developing countries, small island developing states in the Caribbean, to get the necessary concessional resources, concessional loans and grants in order to build capacity to mitigate and to adapt to the effects of climate change. There's some other issues, including the issue of de-risking that has affected a number of our countries, and we will also be advocating for changes there to ensure that there is financial inclusion in order to protect our people, because ultimately between those two issues, climate change and de-risking, we could find out situations in which the socioeconomic gains that we've made over the years, that they could be reversed, and then our people could find themselves in abject poverty. Now, we too have our ambition of achieving all of the Sustainable Development Goals, and these threats are literally undermining the prospects of us achieving those goals, so that we now have to stand up and speak up without fear or favor. There are some who may not necessarily like our message, but again, we recognize that the national interest is at stake here, and we have to stand up for our country respectfully and to speak up and to agitate for change.
Mr. Prime Minister, thanks very much for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you.
We were talking then we have the honor to talk with the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda. We're talking about Mr. Gaston Browne. We get back to you now.
We thank Jorge for that report. So let's take a short break now. Don't go away. Welcome back to From the South. Chavista lawmakers in Venezuela have returned to the opposition-controlled National Assembly. The 50-strong group of elected representatives from the United Socialist Party and its allies rejoined the Assembly's activities as part of the agreement signed with some opposition parties a week ago. President Nicolás Maduro said they would seek to work with other members to overcome the National Assembly's breach of the Constitution. This currently means its decisions are null and void. The Venezuelan opposition figure Lilian Tintori has told an event in Manhattan that her organization, Rescue Venezuela, is working with irregular groups of paramilitaries to distribute humanitarian aid throughout the country.
Right now, Rescue Venezuela, our foundation, we are the capacity to have humanitarian camps in each state of our country. And the people who help us to do this is people around the state, and is the irregular groups, the paramilitaries as well. So everybody wants change and everybody wants help.
Venezuela's national dialogue table continues to make political and economic progress. All parties agree that dialogue should prevail over violence.
1 week since the creation of the dialogue table between the government of Venezuela and the opposition, the dialogue continues to bear fruits. Among its achievements was the freeing of the vice president of the National Assembly who took part in the failed coup attempt of April 30th. Another achievement was the incorporation of a former presidential candidate. They are now focusing on the development of thematic panels.
Today's meeting focused on establishing agreements. We also set an agenda for the next coming days. We have decided to create 8 panels that will give an update in 20 days from now, so that people can give an opinion on what we are doing. We want people to know how the dialogue process is progressing.
The dialogue tables are: table for the review of electoral power and proportional representation, table to evaluate prisoners, table for sovereignty and territorial integrity, national economic table in order to find solutions and review the proposed program of exchanging oil for food, medicine and basic needs, and to condemn the blockade and sanctions, political rights table that will work on the coexistence of popular powers and the work of the National Constituent Assembly, social rights, public services and migration table, political parties, revolutionaries and opposition table, social movements table. The dialogue table is also backed by Russia, China, Uruguay, Mexico, Cuba, Norway. They agree that dialogue should be prevail over violence.
We have always said that these negotiations are complementary. If talks in Norway are re-established, they will be complementary to the national dialogue table. There are no confrontations. We are just looking for a political and constitutional way to end the conflict the country is facing.
1 week of the national dialogue has produced more progress than the 8 months of the violent confrontation led by Juan Guaidó.
We have maintained our position of dialogue and peace. We want to reach agreements that will consolidate peace in the region. Venezuela is a country of peace, in spite of the threats it faces by the right wing and U.S. imperialism.
We will keep moving forward. There is nothing that will stop this negotiation. We will continue working towards this direction in order to get important results.
In response to the progress made at the dialogue table, President Maduro announced that the Chavista political force that had withdrawn from the National Assembly will be back on September 24.
Several flights were grounded at Haiti's international airport on Tuesday after reports of a fire inside the building. According to officials, a fire started at a perfume store located in the departure terminal, but has been brought under control. Hundreds of passengers traveling to the United States and Latin America have been affected, as flights are expected to resume on Wednesday. Investigation into its cause of the fire are ongoing. Former FIFA Vice President Jack Warner has been granted conditional leave to pursue his final appeal over the dismissal of his lawsuits challenging the U.S. extradition request for him. The High Court has, however, set out reduced timeframes for the procedural steps to be taken by Warner. These include paying a fee and settling the record before final leave can be granted for him to take his case to the London-based private counsel. Warner is wanted in the U.S. for fraud-related offenses allegedly committed during his tenure as vice president of the world's football governing body, FIFA. The 76-year-old, who is also a former senior government minister in Trinidad and Tobago, as well as a former CONCACAF president, is challenging the legality of the Extradition Act signed between his country and the U.S. He's currently on $2.5 million bail.
No comments.
A historic feat in Colombia, as the first collective hearing of members of the former FARC was held before the special jurisdiction. They'll be responding to things which took place during the armed conflict in Colombia.
The once commanders of the former guerrilla FARC arrived at the headquarters of the Special Justice for Peace. They were to submit their first collective account of what happened during that armed conflict period, in fulfillment of the agreements signed in the Havana Peace Accords.
This is the first time that a collective account is presented this way. It allows us to reconstruct what took place with many contributions and then help to speed up the reconstruction process.
The hearing began with the naming and identifying of each of the individuals appearing before the court. In total, 7 former commanders from the old FARC, including some who had come from La Guajira, all with a firm commitment to recognize the ethical and political responsibility they have in what took place during those years.
Our struggle was born in the defense of life and the agrarian reform. In this opportunity, we will continue to appear here, on this stage of justice, just as we have done in other spaces, asking for forgiveness and recognizing the errors committed, which ended in the ceasefire and the definitive end to the war, promoting the reconciliation Colombia needs.
The search for truth, justice, and non-repetition are fundamental pillars in this process, where the members of the old FARC must also respond in detail for the demands made by the victims during the course of the conflict.
The demands of the victims who are asking to know what happened with the others who were kidnapped, in addition to the 35 specific petitions for truth, and which are presented on the date by the victims, and which are specific in their questioning regarding their family members or regarding the circumstances of their kidnappings. For this public ministry, it's fundamental that in what's written today, they clarify these requests for truth and many other things.
The FARC members who appeared before the hearing also made a call to the state agents who participated in the war to be part of the clarification of the truth before the victims which the conflict has left in Colombia.
The U.S. House of Representatives have opened a formal impeachment inquiry into President Donald Trump. The inquiry will examine whether Trump sought Ukraine's help to smear former Vice President Joe Biden, the current frontrunner for the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination.
The actions of the Trump presidency revealed the dishonorable fact of the president's betrayal of his oath of office, betrayal of our national security, and betrayal of the integrity of our elections. Therefore, today, I'm announcing the House of Representatives moving forward with an official impeachment inquiry. I'm directing our 6 committees to proceed with their investigations under that umbrella of impeachment inquiry. The president must be held accountable No one is above the law.
And with that story, we've come to the end of this news brief. These and other stories, as always, find them on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also join us on social media. We are on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. For Telesur English, I am Estefania Bravo. Thank you for watching.